Hello everyone, welcome to Intro to Kink and BDSM. Before I dive into this, I just want to note that while I use kink and BDSM interchangeably, some people are more comfortable with one of those labels or the other, or they may be more comfortable talking about the specific activity without the labels being included in the conversation. So just be aware that language can be very different for every individual person. My name is Angel. I use they and she pronouns. I'm the program administrator at Alberta Sex Positive Education Community Centre, and I'm also their in-house sex coach and sex educator. I'm a registered sex educator, certified sex coach, and I'm currently pursuing a master's in counseling. I kind of a bit of a geek when it comes to things like consent law, and I love teaching these courses. I've been in the kink community for over 20 years, ever since I was old enough to know what interested me sexually. I knew that this was something for me, and I've been presenting on this topic for over a dozen years. That doesn't make me an expert. It only makes me an expert in my own journey. So before we dive in, I just want to remind you that you want to get your information from more than one source. And take what you can use in this class and leave what you can't. It's a very personal, individual journey. I want to talk a little bit about our safer space. And for the purpose of this workshop, I'm asking that each of you agree that you can provide a space for other people to ask questions without judgment, and understand that we're all in different places in our learning journey. We all have different relationship styles, etc. And we need to make room for that and assume that everybody is trying to be supportive to one another. Can everybody agree to that? Fantastic. Before I get into your content warning, I would also like to acknowledge how privileged I feel to be standing here on Treaty 6 land offering this workshop. This land is home to many diverse cultures, and I would really like to honor what it means to be standing here right now. If you're unfamiliar with land statements and what colonization is, we offer some beginner workshops on those things, and I really encourage you to get out there and actually listen to some of the documentaries and podcasts and read some of the work by Indigenous activists themselves. Your content warning is that we are going to be talking about sex, nudity, sexuality, sexual assault, kinky sex, deviant sex, consent, social norms, power, control, violence, etc. We can't talk about kink without differentiating between the kinky activities that include consent and an assault. If at any time you need to leave the presentation to engage in self-care, please do so. If you need to reach out after the workshop to debrief, please do email me, and I'll set up either a phone call or a web call, or we can even just chat on text. My email is angel, ANGEL, @aspec.ca. Awesome. So today we're going to talk about BDSM, the rules and the language used in BDSM, how consent is built into the framework of creating a scene and even moving through the scene and after. We're also going to talk about the endorphins that come into play and why it's important to be aware of that, using safe words and aftercare, how to find your community, and various dungeon etiquette and problem solving techniques. It is a lot of information. Do not panic. This is available in a PDF on our website under online workshops. So please feel free to pop in there and download it. It just doesn't have all the audio aspects and the conversation and questions and answers and all that good stuff. But the basic framework is there for you to download. We're coming at this from a sex positive lens. Sex positive just means viewing consensual sex as something that's good, healthy, natural, rather than the view that it's sex negative, in which sex is something to be ashamed of. It's dirty, it's wrong, it's sinful. So our education, all of it, no matter what we're teaching, is under this sex positive framework. And if you have questions about that, please do hit me up after. So BDSM, I love the acronym. It's actually spelt with the letters, and B stands for bondage. Bondage is the erotic use of restraint, which can be anything from tying someone up with rope to pinning their hands down with your hands. It doesn't have to be something elaborate. You can even do verbal bondage where you're like, I'm going to stop if you move. That would also be bondage. Discipline refers to both physical discipline, so things like spankings and other corporal punishment, but it also refers to rule setting, and starts to denote the power exchange relationship as well as the self discipline needed to be able to engage in these kinds of activities in a consensual framework. The DS is domination and submission. And that is a power exchange relationship in which the domination is the taking control of the other person, and submission is giving the control of yourself to that person. And we often see this depicted with a capital D, a forward slash, and a lowercase s to denote that power exchange. The SM also stands for sadomasochism, or sadism and masochism. Sadism is when you can derive pleasure from the giving of intense sensation, and masochism is the deriving of pleasure from receiving intense sensation. And I always like to frame it as intense sensation because as a sadomasochist, I don't want to stub my toe. Like that's not the thing. It's being able to slowly increase the sensations to a point where you're getting all those yummy neurotransmitters flooding your system. And everybody's experience with each of these things is going to be completely different. You're going to hear a lot of people using these labels in ways that'll be slightly different than what I am, and that's okay. It's a very personal thing, what we find sexy and exciting. BDSM roles. So what I've done here is I've divided them. And on the one side, we have master, dom, dominatrix, mistress, top, daddy, mommy, rigger, owner. There's a gazillion more. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just some of the more common ones. And on the other side, we have the people who are typically receiving the sensation or accepting the dominance or submitting to the dominant. Slave, submissive, bottom, baby girl, pet toy, rope bottom, rope bunny, brat. Again, not an exhaustive list. And I put them in boxes because this is how we typically look at BDSM roles until we have a little bit of experience or maybe have explored how labels can be very restrictive. But I know lots of people, and I myself can pick labels from each of these boxes and apply it to myself in and then fits the activities that I do. It fits the relationships I have. So it's important to recognize that although we've separated these by like sort of top roles, the giving and taking of control, and the bottom roles, the submitting and the receiving the sensation, people can, even at the same time, have more than one of these labels from each box. And there are also people who identify as switches, or even people who just aren't kinky. So none of these roles would apply to them. So they would be in the middle. So why do we think people engage in kink? So pleasure, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Most people that get drawn into the kink community, they're looking for that stimulation. They want to play, they want to have fun, they want to experience the pleasure of it. They enjoy the things. That's definitely, and I think that's why it's not part of any sex education program, because they tend to ignore pleasure. There are some people that also engage in some of the kink activities for reasons you might not thought of, for pain management, because if you can change the way the body's interpreting those signals, you can get a break from chronic pain. Some people do it to enjoy the deep intimacy that comes with building this kind of activity with a partner and coming through it out the other side. Some people are really drawn to it because of the clear communication, because of the structure that's involved, can really relieve people who need that structure in order to form those intimate connections. So there's lots of reasons why people come into kink, but pleasure definitely is the very top one. Fluidity. When I first came into the kink community, I was, man, all I wanted to talk about, engage in, and etc. was spanking as a bottom. And I mean, I still have a pin that denotes, being a spanko from back when leather was a little more common. Um, I had no idea that I would be sitting here today as someone who has their own slave, which I don't use that word, is my pet, but he uses that word, so I'm just trying to honor that. Uh, I have playmates that I top. I have some folks I bottom for. I'm a sadomasochist. I have a daddy dom. These are things I never thought I would do. And I had to really learn that although a lot of my identity as I became part of the kink community and explored for years was around that I concept of myself as somebody who was a bottom for spanking only. And that's punny, isn't it? Not on purpose. Anyways, then I met somebody, became really good friends with her, and she was getting into really crappy situations, looking for a dominant. And I was like, I could do that. And I started to learn the skills, and I became her play dom, and we had a hell of a good time. And then she wanted to try it. So, and things just built from there. And as I explored more and more activities with her, there were more and more things I found that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed the self-discipline of learning how to throw a flogger properly and being able to tune into somebody and watch them hit that moment when they trust what's going on enough that their body floods with all those endorphins. And I mean, it was a real rush, and I really enjoyed that. And then when I met my current partner, I discovered that, well, we discovered that we could feed each other more and more enjoyment of that sadomasochistic play. And that opened up a whole new avenue of fun there. And I hope I can help you avoid the pain of struggling with letting go of a label and recognizing that these roles are fluid. And that if you meet somebody in the context of them being a rope top, the next time you see them, they might be in an intense power exchange with somebody as the bottom, or they might be doing a completely different activity. And that's okay, that we're allowed to adjust who we are and what labels fit us as we have different experiences and whatnot. And this has been something that's been talked about a lot in my generation. The younger generation is being a lot more supportive of role fluidity for all genders, whereas back in the day, in the heterosexual community of kink, we found a lot of people were rigid about gender expectations, where they expected masculine people to be in the role of tops and feminine people to be in the role of bottoms. And there was a lot of pushback if you stepped outside of those. And we're seeing now, thanks to this younger generation that's really fought for folks to really review the things that they're assigning to people as traits based on their gender. We're seeing a lot of folks who were always trapped in that master dom top role, exploring bottom and submissive roles, and really getting in touch with themselves in a way that they would have been able to back when our craptastic society was a little more rigid. So yay for fluidity. Also, when we're talking about these labels and whatnot, they're very stereotyped. So if we go back to these labels and you look at like a master-slave relationship, typically people denote that as having really high levels of protocol, so like rituals that they follow, lots of rules, lots of punishment, whereas a dom and a submissive, a little less power exchange, but often also 24/7, a little less protocol. Dominatrix as a professional dom only. And for whatever reason, mistress seems to be seen as less of a power exchange than a master-slave relationship, which I always found really bizarre. Top-bottom tends to donate like the activity-based stuff. So if I was like, hey, do you want to get tied up? And you said, sure, I would be the rope top, you would be the rope bottom, but it doesn't necessarily denote any ongoing relationship, like so forth and so on. Like these are all very stereotyped. Whereas when you start meeting people and they're like, my name's Master Lord Thunder so and so, like find out what that means to them, because everybody has a different spin on what those labels mean. When my partner Mark and I first moved to Edmonton, we had one half of the community insisting that we were in a master slave relationship, which was never been words we've ever used for our relationship. And the other half insisting that, and I put this in quotes, Angel, you're not even a bottom. And because apparently we weren't rigid enough, we didn't play hard enough, or whatever their concept of what those roles meant. And it doesn't matter, because that's how they define those labels. They can use whatever labels they want inside their head. But when it's my relationship, I get to decide what words resonate with me. And when it's your relationship, you get to decide what words resonate with you. But part of expecting that acceptance from the folks around you is also being accepting that the way they define those labels are going to differ from yours. That said, there is a glossary. It's available on this link here. The link's also in the same folder as the PowerPoint, so you should be able to find it there as well. Also, you can type in BDSM glossary into your Google search and you will find dozens and dozens, some of them linking back to the same one. Those definitions are also stereotypes, so just remember, you got to ask people exactly what it means to them. So consent. Consent is often considered like the pillar of anything to do with kink, and there's a really good reason for that. But prior to 1983, people were, particularly in the United States, Canada were a little more laid back about things, but people in the States were often finding themselves on the wrong side of police interest because of their consensual sexual activities. And leather bars were getting raided all the time. And you hear about that when Pride comes up, people talk about the raids in Canada and the States and all over Europe of queer bars, and a lot of them were leather bars, which means that they did include some BDSM and kink context. Not that anyone who's gay is kinky, but they were both so ostracized from mainstream society, and there was some overlap due to some well, I could get into leather history here, but go look up leather history. It's lots of fun. But anyways, David Stein wrote this paper, Safe, Sane, Consensual, and presented it at a conference, and it is very powerful. It's available free online, so feel free to go take a look at that. But that Triskelion that you see quite often being denoted as the BDSM logo, it was something that came up with David Stein's Safe, Sane, Consensual. And the notion was that what we're doing is safe. We all expect to survive it, right? We're doing everything we can to make sure that nobody's permanently injured. And it's sane. We're not coming at this from an unhealthy mind view. And it's consensual. Everybody involved agrees to all the aspects of what's going to happen before it happens. And this ended up being used by medical health professionals, police, like lots of lawyers, things like that, to differentiate between kink and abuse, which was the whole point of the paper. It's like we're not abusing each other. Like this is a safe, sane, consensual exploration between consenting adults, right? But language has changed over the years, the way it does. And people started to question the use of some of those words, like, is kink safe? I mean, we're tying people up. All kinds of things can go bad there. We're smacking people. Things, you can get injured doing kink. So is it safe? Is anything safe? Why are we using that word? And then sane was also questioned. It used to mean that you were being clear of mind and like things like that. And now it is seen as a way of excluding people who have mental health issues like anxiety, depression, personality disorders, that kind of thing. How do you consent if you're not clinically sane? And so those words fell out of favor. And instead, we saw RAC get introduced as a popular way of denoting amongst the community that you were using consensual kink as your framework. And it's risk-aware consensual kink. So when we go to do an activity, the idea is we need to be aware of what the risks are of that activity so that we can both agree to the risks that we're taking and mitigate the risks that we're taking as much as possible. And consensual, everybody consents to it, and kinky, it's slightly deviant, and we're going to do it anyways. So that was REC. In the last few years, PRIC has also come up quite a bit as an acronym people are using, particularly in the leather community tends to really enjoy the PRIC acronym, and it's personal responsibility informed consensual kink. Personal responsibility means that each of us has to be able to take control of our own journey. So we need to decide what we want, learn about it, go out and explore it in ways that match our own risk profiles and interests. And we have to take responsibility for that, meaning some things we try aren't going to work out so great, and that's okay. Like, we don't have to love everything that we check out. And we have to be aware that if we're not doing our own learning, we are putting ourselves at risk for people taking advantage of that ignorance. So it's our job to make sure that we're learning about the things that we're doing, and we're learning how to communicate clearly and all those good things. And then consensual kink. Informed means that if somebody doesn't tell you the nuances of what you're agreeing to, that's not informed, right? So if you come to me, and I've been doing rope now for 12 years, and you're like, hey, Angel, can we do a suspension? And I don't warn you as someone new to the community that, you know, when you do suspension, if the arms are in, you can really dramatically increase the risk of nerve damage. And you know, if I don't warn you that you're going to have marks on you from the rope, that's not informed, right? And ideally, with personal responsibility, we would all be going to look up the things that we're interested in. But maybe you came out to taste a kink and you've never heard of violet wand before. It is a responsibility of the people showing that toy to you to tell you what those risks are and let you know what it is you're agreeing to before asking you to agree. And it's our job to let people know if we don't have information about it. I've never done this before. What do I need to know to be able to consent to this? Right? So that informed piece needs to be there. Much like if you come to me and you're like, hey, can you use the violet wand on me? And you don't tell me that you have an implanted electronic device that controls your heartbeat, then I can't consent because I don't know that we're taking the risk like that, because it is an electrical toy. So the informed part's great. The challenge I find with personal responsibility informed consensual kink is that personal responsibility is exactly that. You look at yourself and you choose what your journey is going to look like, which means you control your own behavior. It's not something you can put on other people, especially hindsighting them, right? Where they've gone out, they've done something and gotten hurt, and go, well, you had a personal responsibility, and then start listing all those really common excuses we have for blaming victims when they're assaulted or abused. And these things have been proven not to prevent assault and abuse, by the way. Whether that's vetting people, which you hear about a lot in the community, which just means checking with their play partners to see if they're consensual and safe, to playing in public, but you can do all of those things and still end up harmed. So I don't particularly care for personal responsibility when it's used to point at someone else and blame them for mishaps that they've experienced. So that's my little rant about consent. Consent is the difference, though, between BDSM and abuse. David Stein was definitely a very eloquent individual, and I really appreciate that they did that groundwork. This graphic here, the red circle shows the power and abuse cycle, and the black one shows the kink cycle. This red cycle here, what you see is the honeymoon phase, is all the stuff that happens to make you feel like you're in an amazing relationship. And then there's the planning, the setup, the thing that happens that's abusive, and then the guilting and the gaslighting and the making excuses, back to building you up to thinking it's a great relationship, and it just spirals like that. With kink, with the consent involved, you're communicating exactly what you want to do, and there's an agreement. So there's not planning and setup. There's planning and setup together, right? And you come to an agreement that includes what can and cannot be done. And then the activity happens, and after, there's aftercare, taking care of one another to make sure everybody's okay. and then debriefing. So talking about what worked, what didn't work, and what not, so that you can go back into the communication phase and build a better scene. When you look at this little graphic here with the stick men, when you're looking on the outside, it can look the same if you don't know what to look for. The things we want to look for is the checking in, the use of safe words, the caring for each other throughout it, the person being excited to go and do the activity, not terrified to go and do the activity, although sometimes with some edge play, there's some fear in there. That they're building trust rather than destroying it, that they're feeling good about it afterwards. So there's like a whole list of things here. And this is on the inside of our pamphlet for doctors who have clients that are into kink, as a way for them to stop assuming that all kink activity is abuse activity. Consent is a really big deal. It really matters. There are accidents, and there are people who are habitual abusers that you will find in the community. We differentiate between accidents and habitual abuse in a few ways. When an accident happens, the person takes responsibility for it. Like, for example, I had a scene where somebody asked for no tickling. I tickled them, but what I thought I was doing was scratching. I was using like things that are sharp on their skin. And to me, that's not a tickly sensation. To them, it was. And afterwards, they were like, this was fun, but you tickled me and I asked you not to. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is totally on me. I'm so sorry. When it's habitual abuse, what we see is, sorry, I thought I had to stop the recording. When it's habitual abuse, what we see is a lack of accountability, a lot of blaming, a lot of making excuses, a lot of finding it more important to prove to the person that you're a good person rather than just owning it, trying to move forward and doing a better job next time. We also see with habitual abusers that even if they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again. And they may not do that exact thing again, but they'll do something parallel, right? Either they'll do it with someone else, they'll do the exact same thing, or they'll find another of your don'ts to kind of override and have like a convenient excuse as to why not. So, and we see that it's in their behavior. It's not just a mistake in communication. So be sure that you can recognize the difference between accidents, which will happen when you're doing this kind of intimate stuff. It's very subjective and things will happen, versus somebody who's habitually pushing against your boundaries or trying to convince you to go around your boundaries. We also ensure consent a few fun ways. We negotiate as equals, first and foremost. Everybody has to feel free to say no to things and set boundaries in order to be able to enthusiastically say yes. We use safe words, typically red, yellow, green in North America and Europe, or the word safe word. Red, yellow, green is really easy, and because of the stoplight system, people tend to figure it out really quick, but make sure you talk to your partner about what the safe words are going to be. Don't assume they're using the ones I'm telling you. Even with safe words, though, we need to check in. So if body language changes, their tone of voice changes, they stop reciprocating, we need to stop and check in. And we don't do that by going, are you green? We ask them what color they are so that they have to engage the front of their brain. Open-end questions, people. Don't give them a question where they can just repeat the last word you said. Once we start doing things, we also want to make sure that we're not adding things, even if everybody seems keen on it, that we didn't agree to in the negotiation. We can remove things we agreed to, like we can make it less vulnerable. If we agreed to nudity and someone's not comfortable, they can put clothes back on. That's totally cool. But if we agreed no nudity and things are going really well, we don't want to be like, let's get nude anyways, because that's not what was negotiated for, and it can create a breach of trust. Afterwards, we take care of each other, which is aftercare, and then once everybody's back into their normal headspace, we can debrief, and sometimes that's the next day, and that's okay. But all of these things are the tools for ensuring that we have consent. When we're engaged in kink, we can end up with a feeling of euphoria. It's a lot like runner's high. And we call this subspace, although tops can feel it too. Tops feel it to a lesser degree, though, because they're actually getting mirror neurons in going on rather than their own physically induced neural dumps. So, like, that's kind of cool. There's a bit of information if you're really interested, and we run a workshop just on your brain on sex and kink. It's pretty cool. I highly suggest you check it out. The person who does it is like totally into that kind of stuff. But basically, your brain is flooded with really feel good neurotransmitters, makes you feel amazing. And it can freak people out if they weren't expecting it. So know that that headspace is not disassociating, even though everything starts to feel a little further away and, like kind of cloudy. But it also feels good. So disassociation feels like nothing. So if you're concerned, talk to your partner and maybe stop and let yourself come back out of subspace a bit. Once you've had that dopamine dump, though, you can experience a drop. It's a period of time where you feel low or tired or even depressed. And it's not even uncommon for someone to get all frenzied where they feel like they have to do all the kink things right now. And we have flyers on each of these topics that explores that more in depth. I really encourage you to go through them and really become familiar with it, because we found that we can mitigate all the negative parts of these sensations just by being aware of it and having a good understanding of what we need to do to help ourselves through it. Aftercare is one of the things that can mitigate the sensation of drop. There's just a period of time where we're making certain that we communicate, we reestablish that equality. So in the play, there's a power exchange that happens even if we didn't mean it to, because you're letting someone do something to you, or someone's letting you do something to them. And we need to reestablish that fullness of being a person and resetting those boundaries. It's also a time of learning and growth where you can think about what you liked and didn't like and talk about it and see if you can't improve things for next time. Does anybody have any questions on that? Fantastic. The local community typically has munches and dungeons and workshops and conventions. You can find all that stuff on FetLife. You can meet people on Kick. COVID, of course, has changed things quite a bit, but there's a lot of online community. Make sure you get out there and explore things. Find out what's going on in your location. If you're worried about being outed, just make a scene name that has nothing to do with you, and take a picture of your feet or something for your profile. There's lots of etiquette to be aware of as you navigate your community. Discretion is a big one. People don't want to be outed. They want to make sure that their privacy is being respected, and that includes not being stalked on Facebook when somebody found you on FetLife. You also don't want to touch people or their toys without their permission. If you don't know how to use the equipment, I'd recommend you ask somebody, typically a host, how the equipment is used before you start touching it. Role play also involves consent. So if you're a little or a dom or whatever, no one else has to engage in that power exchange with you without previously consenting to it. Like, they have to, in that moment, they have to agree to it before you start running up and humping their leg or demanding they call you sir, whatever the case may be. You also need to know that public and private play are dramatically different. Public spaces typically have posted rules and orientations and people walking around looking out for you, that kind of thing. Whereas private play, the rules can vary dramatically from one group to the next. So make sure you check out what their behavior expectations are before you go. I highly recommend that you become aware of the whisper network. So if you're thinking of playing with someone, listen for gossip about them to make sure that they're not somebody who's being talked about in a way as if they're a dangerous player or someone that is known for non-consensual behaviors. And you also need to be aware that every space has its own cleanup rules. Some places require barriers, some allow sex, some don't, all that good stuff. Most events have an orientation like this, where we go through some of the things that are expected. Some places allow pickup play. There are a lot of people who are in monogamous full-time relationships that will play with people outside of their relationship because BDSM doesn't have to include sex. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Some people prefer it does, some people prefer it doesn't. So we do see a lot of monogamous couples coming in and playing with other people, and they might engage in pickup play. Lots of singles, it's a really common thing. So pickup play is when you don't come with the person you're going to do things with. You're hoping to find someone to do the things with, and you communicate that, and hopefully somebody is like game to do that thing. Most dungeons have a social space and a play space, and you're not supposed to play where people are sitting, and you're not supposed to sit where people are playing. You need to be quiet when you're wandering around watching people engage in the things, that you don't intrude on their scene, on their playtime. Every space will have its own rules about nudity and sex, and even at ASPECC, some events allow sex, some don't. Some events allow nudity, some don't. Same with whether or not you have to use condoms and gloves and what tools you need to clean up, and whether or not there's dungeon monitors, which has nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons, but instead is people that wander around making sure that you have the barriers you need, that you can find the things that you need, and that everybody's playing safely. And every organization will have its own ideas of what safety is, which are their safety protocols, such as needing to have safety shares to do rope, for example. There's also different rules on how to report problems. Some places don't have rules at all about reporting problems. So make sure you're familiar with who you go to if there is an issue. And just as a side note, this study by Joanne Carpentier out of Quebec, which isn't new anymore, but it's a few years old now, they explored sexual deviance, but they didn't use those words. And what they found is if they didn't use the words kink, bondage, sadomasochism, any of that, and instead just talked about the activities, that over 80% of people responded that they did either engage in or fantasize about things like bondage or giving and receiving of pain during sex. So might not be as deviant as we thought. Also, this is a very diverse community, so please do not assume that you can tell what somebody's gender is by looking at them, or that they're straight, or that they're monogamous or poly or whatever. You need to let people tell you what labels they use and how they experience life, rather than making those assumptions. So, BDSM and kink, very complex, can't really completely depict it in a PowerPoint. But if you go forward with the idea that your kink's not my kink, and that's okay, meaning that if somebody's doing something you don't enjoy, that's okay, as long as they have consent and they're doing things in a way that fits their risk profile. Not really our business, right? And that we can ask for clarification and respect personal choices and diversity. And then you'll find that you have a lot of fun navigating the community, and you're going to meet a lot of interesting people. Some places you can find more information are books like Screw the Roses, for example, anything by Dr. Bob. The internet can be a hit or miss place to find information. There's lots of workshops hosted by lots of organizations. National Coalition of Sexual Freedom is a really good resource, ncsfreedom.org. There's videos online you can watch, learn how to do rope or throw floggers and stuff, and you're going to learn a lot just by meeting other people. Conferences and workshops are pretty scarce right now due to the whole COVID thing, but hopefully that'll change. So I would just like to thank you all for coming out. This is our question and answer period. For folks that are watching the recording, I've had to cut out other people's voices just for privacy reasons. But do know that if you have questions, you can reach out to me at my email.